Did you know that in 1896, construction workers demolishing an abandoned Pennsylvania institution discovered a hidden room containing 73 pairs of children's shoes, all arranged in perfect rows, all filled with human teeth? The building was St. Allora's House of Restoration, and what they found beneath the chapel floor would haunt investigators for generations. But the shoes were just the beginning. Clara Malin died in 1880. At least, that's what the record said. Number 41. Expired during evening prayers. Cause unknown. Remains processed according to protocol. Sister Isolde had written it herself in both ledgers, white and red. The notation was clean, final, bureaucratic. Another wayward girl returned to God's grace through Mother Agatha's divine guidance. But Clara Malin did not die in 1880. She escaped. It took her 3 years to plan. 3 years of perfect obedience, of becoming invisible, of making them forget she was dangerous. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She recited scripture with her eyes downcast. She took Sister Eugenie's tinctures without resistance and learned to fake the glassy-eyed compliance they produced. She became the model of reformation, so thoroughly broken that even Sister Marcella stopped watching her. And on a freezing January night in 1880, while Brother Thorne cleared ice from the chapel steps and the sisters prepared for Compline, Clara slipped through the garden gate wearing a dead girl's coat and walked into the forest without looking back. She was 17 years old. She had been number 41 for 5 years, and she carried with her something no one knew existed. A list of names carved into a wooden spoon she'd stolen from the kitchen. Names of every girl who had vanished during her imprisonment. 73 names. 73 girls who had entered the night choir and never returned. The night choir. Even now, 18 years later, the words made Clara's hands shake. It wasn't a punishment. It was worse than punishment. It was selection. Every few weeks, Sister Marcella would walk through the dormitory after lights out, her candle casting monstrous shadows on the walls. And she would stop beside a bed and whisper a number, just a number, and that girl would rise, silent and trembling, and follow Sister Marcella down the stairs, through the refectory, past the chapel, to the door that was always locked except on those nights, the door that led down. Clara had been chosen twice. The first time, she was 13. They'd taken her to a room beneath the chapel, cold and damp, where Brother Thorne waited with his instruments, and Sister Eugenie with her potions. They'd strapped her to a chair and asked her questions about her sins, about her impure thoughts, about the wickedness that lived in her heart. When she couldn't answer or answered wrong, Brother Thorne would adjust the straps until she couldn't breathe, until darkness crept into her vision, until she was certain she would die there in that chair beneath the earth. But she didn't die. They brought her back just before the end, every time, and sent her back to the dormitory with instructions to pray for forgiveness and speak to no one about her purification. The second time they chose her, 6 months later, she fought. She screamed and clawed and bit Sister Marcella's hand so hard she drew blood. For that, they kept her below for 3 days. 3 days in darkness, in cold, listening to sounds she couldn't identify, sounds that might have been machinery or might have been screaming. She could never be sure. When they finally brought her back up, she was different, quieter, more obedient, exactly what they wanted. But inside, in the secret places they couldn't reach, Clara had made a decision. She would survive, she would escape, and she would remember. So she started carving names. Every girl she knew who went down and didn't come back, every face that disappeared from morning prayers, every empty bed that was filled with a new girl the next day, as if the previous occupant had never existed. She carved them into her wooden spoon during mealtimes, tiny letters that looked like grain patterns, names like prayers for the dead. 73 names by the time she escaped. 73 girls swallowed by St. Allora's and never released. For 18 years, Clara Malin lived in silence. She worked under false names in textile mills across Pennsylvania and New York. She married a printer's assistant named Thomas Glade, who never asked about her past. She had 2 children and raised them with fierce, protective love, never letting them out of her sight, never sending them to church schools, never trusting anyone in religious authority. But every night, she dreamed of the incinerator. Every night, she heard the bells that never stopped ringing in her memory. And every night, she recited those 73 names, like a rosary of the damned, until 1898, when she read a small notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer: historic diocese property to be demolished, St. Allora's site cleared for development. The article was brief, bureaucratic. The church had finally sold the land. The buildings, long abandoned after mysterious circumstances forced their closure in 1891, were to be razed and the property converted to farmland. Demolition would begin in 6 weeks. Clara read it 3 times, her hands shaking so violently the newspaper tore. They were going to erase it completely, bury the evidence, turn it into wheat fields, and forget it ever existed. She couldn't let that happen. That night, Clara told her husband she needed to visit her dying aunt in Pittsburgh. He believed her, like he believed everything she told him, because Clara had learned long ago how to make lies sound like truth. She kissed her children goodbye, packed a small traveling case, and boarded a train heading north. But Clara wasn't going to Pittsburgh. She was going back to St. Allora's, and this time, she was bringing the dead with her. The building looked smaller than she remembered, as all childhood nightmares do when confronted in daylight. The main residence hall sagged inward. Its roof collapsed on the eastern side. The chapel tower stood skeletal against gray sky, its bell long since removed. Vines had consumed the servant quarters. The garden wall had crumbled into moss-covered stone, but the incinerator wing remained intact. Its chimney still stood, black and defiant, like a monument to everything that had burned within. Clara arrived at dawn, carrying only her traveling case and a kerosene lantern. The gate hung open, rusted and forgotten. No guards, no workers yet, just the wind, moving through empty corridors, and the crows that nested in the eaves. She walked through the front entrance, her footsteps echoing in spaces that had once demanded silence. The receiving hall, where she'd been stripped of her name. The refectory where girls ate in rows, heads bowed, mouths moving only to consume. The dormitories, with their narrow beds and high windows designed to let in light, but prevent escape. All empty now, all quiet. But the quiet was wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of held breath, of things waiting. Clara moved through the west wing toward the chapel, her lantern casting long shadows against peeling walls. She passed the infirmary where Sister Eugenie had administered her potions, bitter drafts that made time stretch and contract, that made girls compliant and docile. She passed the reflection chambers where girls were locked in darkness for days, where silence was enforced so absolutely that some forgot how to speak. She passed the corridor that led to the cold ward, where Sister Corvina Bell had been silenced. Clara stopped there, her breath catching. She'd almost forgotten about Sister Corvina, the young nun who had tried to help, who had smuggled food to girls in isolation, who had questioned Mother Agatha's methods. She disappeared one winter night in 1878, and the next morning Mother Agatha announced she had been transferred for her own spiritual well-being. But Clara had seen Sister Corvina's habit, hanging in the cold ward, torn and bloody. She'd seen the locks changed on certain doors. She'd understood even then that the purification didn't only apply to the girls. Anyone who questioned Mother Agatha vanished. Clara forced herself to keep moving. The chapel was ahead, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, morning light filtered through broken stained glass, casting colored shadows across the nave. The pews had been removed, probably salvaged and sold. The altar remained, stone and permanent, too heavy to move. And behind the altar, partially hidden by fallen timbers, was the door Clara had been forbidden to open. The door that led down. It was unlocked. Clara descended carefully, her lantern held high, counting steps the way she used to count prayers. 15 steps down into earth and stone, The air grew colder with each step, thick with the smell of damp brick and something else. Something old and organic and wrong, something like decay. At the bottom, a narrow corridor stretched into darkness. Along the walls, iron hooks jutted from stone. Some still held scraps of fabric, gray wool from uniforms, fragments of linen stiff with age and rust-colored stains. The floor was stained dark in patterns Clara recognized. Drag marks, leading deeper into the passage. She followed them, her heart hammering against her ribs. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, roughly circular, with a vaulted ceiling supported by stone pillars. In the center stood a wooden table, warped with age but still solid, its surface scarred with cuts and stains that looked disturbingly deliberate, arranged in patterns. Around it, 3 smaller rooms branched off, each with a heavy door fitted with exterior bolts that locked from the outside. Clara approached the first door and pulled it open. The hinges screamed. Inside was a cell, no more than 6 feet square, with chains bolted to the wall at heights, suggesting they'd been meant for children. A drain in the floor, clogged with something Clara didn't want to identify. Scratched into the stone above the chains were marks, hundreds of them, clustered like desperate prayers. Tally marks, days, selections. Clara couldn't tell, and beneath them, carved with something sharp enough to cut stone, 2 words that made Clara's throat close: Help US. The second cell was worse. It contained the chair she remembered, modified with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, neck, and waist. Beside it, a small table held instruments Clara couldn't fully identify. Rusted metal tools with curved edges and strange joints. Devices that looked medical but wrong, as if designed for procedures no legitimate doctor would perform. On the wall, barely visible in the lamplight, someone had written in what looked like dried blood, "Thorn was here," and beneath it, a date, November 1877. But it was the third cell that made Clara's lantern slip from her hand. It was full of bones, not scattered, not discarded, arranged, stacked along the walls in careful rows. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, skulls, small skulls, the size of children's heads, 70, maybe 80 of them, all facing forward like a congregation frozen in death. And in the center of the room, untouched by decay, was a wooden crate marked with a single word burned into its lid: Choir. Clara's hands shook as she pried the crate open. The lid resisted, sealed with old wax, but she forced it up with a piece of broken stone. Inside, nested in rotted velvet, were items that made her stomach heave. Locks of hair bound with ribbon, 73 of them, each labeled with a number. Small leather journals filled with notations in Brother Thorne's handwriting, documenting weights, measurements, reactions to various chemicals and procedures. Methodical, scientific, monstrous. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a collection of photographs. Clara lifted them into the light with trembling fingers. They showed girls, young girls dressed in white shifts, standing against a dark backdrop, but their eyes were wrong, vacant and distant, staring at nothing with the glazed expression of the drugged or dying. And their mouths, Clara realized with rising horror, their mouths were sewn shut with black thread, neat stitches that pulled the lips into grotesque parodies of peaceful silence. Beneath each photograph, a caption in careful script: Number 23 prepared for final devotion, or Number 61 achieved silence, or Number H transcendence successful. These weren't memorial photographs. They were trophies. Clara sank to her knees among the bones, bile rising in her throat. For 18 years she had survived by telling herself that maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe she'd imagined the worst of it. Maybe the girls had simply been transferred like the ledgers claimed. Maybe Saint Allora's had been cruel, but not murderous. Maybe she'd escaped from harsh discipline, not from death. But here was the truth, rotting in the darkness where it had always been. They hadn't transferred the girls. They had murdered them, systematically, ritualistically, year after year, and they had kept the evidence like sacred relics, like proof of holy work accomplished. Clara didn't know how long she knelt there, surrounded by bones and photographs, her mind fragmenting under the weight of confirmation. Minutes, hours, time had stopped meaning anything in that place, where so many girls' time had been stolen. But then she heard something that snapped her back to the present. Footsteps above her in the chapel. Someone else was in the building. Clara grabbed her lantern and moved quickly back through the corridor, her heart hammering. She reached the stairs and climbed as quietly as she could, pressing herself against the damp stone wall as she approached the door. Through the gap, she could see a figure standing in the nave, silhouetted against the broken windows. A woman, elderly, dressed in black, leaning heavily on a cane. She stood before the altar, her head bowed as if in prayer. Clara recognized the posture, the shape of the shoulders, even after 18 years. Sister Isolde, the record keeper, hadn't died with the others. She'd survived, and now she'd returned. Clara pushed the door open fully and stepped into the chapel. Her footsteps echoed on stone. Isolde turned slowly, her face skeletal in the gray light, her eyes still sharp despite her age. When she saw Clara, she didn't look surprised. She looked almost pleased, like she'd been expecting this meeting. "Number 41, she said softly. "I wondered if you would come." Clara's voice, unused to confrontation for so many years, came out hoarse. "My name is Clara Malin." "No," Isolde replied almost gently. "You stopped being Clara Malin the day you arrived here. That girl died in this place, just like all the others. You're simply a ghost that refuses to rest." She tilted her head, studying Clara with the same clinical detachment Clara remembered from those days when Isolde would record their heights, weights, and infractions in her meticulous ledgers. "But you're a persistent ghost. I'll give you that." "I found the chamber," Clara said. "I found what you did." Isolde nodded slowly, unbothered by the accusation. "Of course you did. That's why you came back, isn't it? To bear witness, to carry the weight of our holy work into the light." She moved closer, her cane tapping against stone like a countdown. "But you don't understand. None of you ever understood. We weren't monsters, child. We were servants of a higher calling. You murdered children. We purified souls." Isolde corrected, her voice taking on the lecturing tone Clara remembered from scripture lessons. "We removed sin from the world. Those girls came to us corrupted, broken, destined for damnation. Daughters of whores, thieves, degenerates. They carried wickedness in their blood. We gave them transcendence. We gave them purpose." Mother Agatha saw visions, true visions. She knew that suffering was the only path to grace, that the flesh must be destroyed so the spirit could ascend. Clara felt rage rising in her chest, hot and wild. They were children, innocent children. "There are no innocent children," Isolde said firmly, her eyes glittering with absolute conviction. "Original sin lives in every heart from the moment of birth. We simply helped them atone earlier than most, and they did ascend. I saw it myself. In their final moments, when the pain pushed them beyond the flesh, they found peace, they found God, they found death. Death is a beginning, not an end. Death is the doorway." Isolde smiled, a terrible, gentle smile. "Why do you think we kept the bones? Why do you think we arranged them so carefully? They're not remains, number 41. They're a cathedral, a monument to transformation. Every skull is a prayer made manifest. Every rib is a hymn to suffering transcended." Clara stared at her, understanding finally that Isolde wasn't just evil. She was insane. They all had been. Mother Agatha, Brother Thorn, Sister Eugenie, all of them lost in a delusion so complete they'd convinced themselves that torture was salvation. Isolde reached into her coat and withdrew something small and silver, a key. "I've come to finish what we started," she said. "The demolition workers arrive tomorrow. They'll tear this place apart, stone by stone. They'll find the chamber, they'll find the bones, and they'll tell stories, horrible stories, painting us as devils when we were angels doing difficult work." She held up the key, turning it in the light. "But there's another room, number 41. One more chamber beneath the incinerator. One more collection of evidence. And in that room is the complete record. Every name, every face, every moment of transformation, documented in Mother Agatha's own hand. The true ledger, the one that proves we were right, that shows the divine beauty of our purpose." Clara's blood ran cold. "You want me to help you destroy it?" I want you to understand it. Isolde said, "Come with me, see the truth, read Mother Agatha's words, look at the photographs, the measurements, the careful documentation of each girl's journey from corruption to purity, and then decide for yourself whether the world deserves to know what holiness really requires." She turned and began walking toward the west wing, toward the incinerator, her cane marking slow rhythm against stone. Clara followed, not because she believed Isolde, but because she needed to see everything. She needed to know the full scope of the horror, so that when she testified, when she brought this evil into the light, there would be no doubt, no room for the church to explain it away, no possibility of it being forgotten again. They moved through the ruined corridors, Clara keeping her distance, her hand wrapped around the wooden spoon in her pocket, the one carved with 73 names, her proof, her purpose. The incinerator wing was darker than the rest, its windows completely bricked over. The furnace itself stood dormant, its iron doors sealed with rust and chain, but beside it, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of wall, was a hatch in the floor. Isolde knelt with difficulty and pulled it open. Below, a ladder descended into absolute darkness. "After you," she said. Clara hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger. This was a trap. Isolde wanted her down there for a reason. The old woman was frail, but desperation and madness made people capable of terrible things. But she had come too far to stop now. She lit her lantern, hooked it to her belt, and climbed down. The ladder dropped 10 feet into a chamber much smaller than the one beneath the chapel. This one was barely large enough for 2 people to stand. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were books, dozens of them, ledgers, journals, photograph albums, all bound in identical black leather. And in the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, sat one large book bound in red, Mother Agatha's True Ledger. Clara reached for it with trembling hands. The leather was soft, well-maintained, as if someone had been caring for it all these years. She opened it to a random page. What she saw made her head swim. Detailed anatomical drawings, notes on pain thresholds, observations about how long the child could survive various deprivations, chemical formulas, surgical procedures, all documented with scientific precision, all framed in the language of religious ecstasy. Subject 23 responded beautifully to the 7th purification. At the moment of transcendence, her eyes reflected divine light. The Lord was pleased with this offering. The incinerator method proves most efficient for disposal, though we must be careful with temperature control to ensure complete reduction. Brother Thorne suggests. Clara couldn't read more. Her hands were shaking too badly. Behind her, she heard the hatch slam shut. The ladder rattled as Isolde descended. "I told you the truth," Isolde said from the darkness. "This room contains everything, every moment of our sacred work, documented with perfect precision." Mother Agatha believed that one day the world would be ready to understand, that someone worthy would come to receive the knowledge and continue the great work. She emerged into the lantern light, and Clara saw that she was no longer holding her cane. She was holding a knife, long and sharp, the blade catching lamplight like ice. "I thought it might be Sister Corvina," Isolde continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. She was so close to understanding before she broke, but she questioned, she doubted, and doubt is the enemy of transcendence. So we helped her achieve silence. She smiled. "She's in the walls of the cold ward. If you were wondering, brick by brick we built her tomb, and she never made a sound after the 3rd day." Clara backed against the shelves, her mind racing. The room was too small, no way out except the ladder, and Isolde stood between her and escape. "You, number 41, you're different," Isolde said, moving closer. "You survived. You carried the memory. You came back. That shows strength. That shows divine purpose. And when you join the others, when your transformation is complete, the circle will be perfect. 74, a holy number. Mother Agatha would be pleased." She raised the knife. "They'll find this place. They'll find the books, and they'll burn them. because the world isn't ready for truth. But before that happens, before the evidence is destroyed, one more soul will be purified, one more prayer will be answered. Clara grabbed the nearest ledger and threw it at her. Isolde stumbled. Clara lunged for the ladder, but Isolde was faster than she looked, her madness giving her terrible speed. She grabbed Clara's ankle and pulled hard. They crashed together onto the stone floor. The impact drove the air from Clara's lungs. She rolled, kicking, and felt her foot connect with something soft. Isolde gasped. The lantern fell, its glass shattering. Oil spread across the ground, and flame licked across the floor toward the shelves lined with books. Clara kicked free and scrambled for the ladder. Her hands found the rungs, slick with oil. She pulled herself up, her shoulders screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, Isolde laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You can't escape. This is your tomb. This is where you've always belonged. All the girls return to St. Allora's eventually. Clara reached the hatch and shoved it open. She pulled herself through and collapsed onto the floor above, coughing. Her hands burned from the hot metal rungs. Below, the flames spread rapidly, consuming the journals, the photographs, the careful documentation of Mother Agatha's madness. And somewhere in that fire, Isolde was screaming, not in pain but in something like ecstasy, like she was finally achieving the transcendence she'd promised so many others. The Lord receives me, she shrieked. I am purified. I am transformed. The harvest is complete. Clara didn't wait. She ran. She ran through the west wing, through the chapel, through the receiving hall, out into the morning air. Behind her, smoke began pouring from the incinerator chimney, black and thick, a pillar of darkness rising into the gray sky. She ran until she reached the road, until she reached the town, until she reached the sheriff's office, and pounded on the door with both fists, shouting words that tumbled out in a torrent of 18 years of silence. There are children buried under St. Allora's. They murdered them. I can prove it. You have to dig. You have to dig now before it all burns. The sheriff, a middle-aged man named Dalton Reeves, stared at this wild-eyed woman covered in soot, and speaking of murders at an abandoned church, he'd heard stories about St. Allora's. Everyone in the county had. Rumors of abuse, whispers of girls who went in and never came out. But they were just stories, urban legends, the kind of dark folklore that clung to any old abandoned building, weren't they? But something in Clara's eyes made him believe. Or maybe it was the smoke he could see rising from the hills, black and wrong. The kind of smoke that came from something more than wood burning. Get the fire brigade, he told his deputy, and bring shovels, all the shovels we have. By the time they reached St. Allora's, the incinerator wing had collapsed entirely. The fire had spread to the western dormitory, consuming the wooden structures, but the chapel stood, and the main residence hall, and most importantly, the stone foundations. Clara led them to the door behind the altar. She led them down 15 steps into the corridor beneath. She led them to the 3 cells, and when Sheriff Reeves entered the 3rd cell and saw the bones arranged like a congregation, when he saw the small skulls lined in rows, when he counted them once, and then again, and then a 3rd time because he couldn't believe what he was seeing, he turned to Clara and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "How many?" 73, Clara said. "That I know of. But there are more. There are always more. Blank, _ blank. They excavated for 6 weeks. Beneath the chapel, they found the 3 chambers Clara had discovered, and the bones within. Beneath the incinerator, in the collapsed chamber where Isolde had died, they found fragments of burned journals, enough to reconstruct partial records. The documentation was damning. Detailed accounts of purifications, chemical experiments, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. Beneath the garden, they found a mass grave containing the remains of at least 30 more individuals, buried without markers, without ceremony. Some had been there so long the bones had nearly dissolved into the soil, and beneath the foundation of the servant quarters, they found something that made even the hardened excavation workers refuse to continue. A network of tunnels, hand-dug, leading to small cavities in the earth. In each cavity, a body, children's bodies, some still wrapped in gray wool uniforms, some chained, some showing signs of trauma that the medical examiner refused to detail in his public report. One of the workers, a man named Joseph who'd served in the war and thought he'd seen everything, emerged from the tunnels white-faced and shaking. "There's a girl down there," he said, "can't be more than 10 years old, and she's holding a doll. They buried her holding a doll." He quit the next day and never spoke of it again. In total, they recovered the remains of 109 individuals, all female, all between the ages of 8 and 17. The medical examiner, Dr. Harrison Polk, conducted autopsies on the remains that were complete enough to examine. His findings, delivered in a voice devoid of emotion but eyes haunted by what he'd seen, included multiple instances of healed fractures indicating repeated physical trauma, evidence of malnutrition and vitamin deficiency consistent with prolonged starvation, chemical burns on bone tissue suggesting exposure to industrial agents, modifications to skeletal structure consistent with prolonged binding or confinement in small spaces during developmental years, and in 7 cases, marks on the skull that suggested trepanation, holes drilled into the bone while the victims were alive. Dr. Polk submitted his report and then took a 6-month leave of absence. He never worked as a medical examiner again. The church moved quickly to distance itself from St. Allora's. The diocese issued statements expressing shock and horror, claiming the institution had operated independently, that Mother Agatha and her staff had acted without oversight or approval, that this was an aberration, a tragedy, an evil that had hidden itself behind a cloth. But Clara knew better. She'd seen the correspondence in the burned journals, fragments of letters between Mother Agatha and church officials. She'd seen the inspection reports filed and ignored. She'd seen the tuition payments from wealthy families, the referrals from parish priests, the ecclesiastical approvals that had allowed St. Allora's to exist for 29 years without interference. The church had known, maybe not the full extent, but they had known something was wrong. They had received complaints from concerned relatives, reports from local doctors who treated girls after their release, testimony from former employees who fled in the night, and they had looked away because St. Allora's was profitable, because it took problem girls off the hands of respectable families, because it maintained the appearance of order and righteousness. The trial, such as it was, never happened. Mother Agatha had died in 1889, cause officially listed as heart failure, though Clara suspected she'd been poisoned by Sister Marcella, who disappeared the same week. Sister Marcella had vanished after the institution closed, never to be found. Sister Eugenie had died in a fire in 1892, along with 3 other nuns, at a convent in Vermont. Brother Thorne had simply vanished, his real name never confirmed, his whereabouts unknown, and Sister Isolda, the last guardian of St. Allora's secrets, had burned with the evidence she'd tried to protect. There was no one left to prosecute, no one left to punish. Only the dead remained, and the one survivor who had dared to come back. Clara testified before a grand jury, before church investigators, before journalists who filled notebooks with her words. She told them everything she remembered. The numbers, the silence, the night choir, the selections, the screaming that came from beneath the chapel in the hours before dawn. She showed them the wooden spoon carved with 73 names, and she watched as the world expressed its shock, its horror, its disbelief that such evil could exist in a house of God. But Clara wasn't satisfied with shock. She wanted change. She spent the next 12 years of her life traveling, speaking, testifying before state legislatures about the need for oversight of religious institutions, about the rights of institutionalized children, about the dangers of unquestioned authority. She spoke at women's clubs, reform societies, civic organizations. She wrote letters to newspapers, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen. She became known as The Voice of the Vanished Girls, a title she hated but accepted because it kept their memory alive. She published a book in 1902, The Silent Choir, a survivor's account of St. Allora's House of Restoration. It sold poorly, too disturbing for most readers, too accusatory for the church. But it was read by the people who mattered: social reformers, child welfare advocates, investigators. Laws changed, slowly, painfully slowly, but they changed. Mandatory inspections, public records, limits on corporal punishment, rights of appeal for institutionalized children. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Clara died in 1924, at the age of 61, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words, according to her daughter, were the names, all 73 of them, recited like a prayer. The site of St. Allora's was never developed. The church sold the land to the state, which declared it a protected area, officially for environmental reasons, unofficially because no one wanted to build on ground that held so much death. A small memorial was erected in 1930, a simple stone marker listing the names of the recovered victims. Not all of them could be identified, but Clara's wooden spoon provided 73. The rest were listed as unknown child, with the date of recovery. For decades, the memorial stood alone, visited occasionally by historians or descendants searching for lost family members. The forest reclaimed the ruins. The foundations crumbled. Nature, indifferent to human horror, continued its work. But the dead, as the old stories say, have a way of clawing back to the surface. In 1996, a group of researchers from a Pennsylvania university received permission to conduct archaeological surveys of the site. They used ground-penetrating radar to map the remaining foundations and search for any additional burial sites that might have been missed in the original excavation. What they found made headlines across the country. Beneath the collapsed bell tower, in a section of ground that had never been excavated, the radar showed a large rectangular anomaly, a chamber approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, buried 12 feet below ground level. The excavation took 3 months. What they found inside defied explanation. It was a room, perfectly preserved by the collapsed stone above it. A chapel within a chapel, secret and hidden. The walls were covered in murals painted directly onto stone, depicting scenes of children ascending to heaven while flames consumed their earthly bodies. But the faces of the ascending children were wrong, twisted in expressions that looked more like agony than ecstasy, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. In the center stood an altar made of stacked bones, human bones, arranged with architectural precision into a structure that resembled a throne. And surrounding the altar in concentric circles were 73 pairs of children's shoes. Each pair was filled with teeth, human teeth, small molars and incisors from young mouths, hundreds of them, carefully collected and preserved. The researchers stood in that chamber, their flashlights illuminating a nightmare made manifest, and understood finally what the night choir had truly been. Not a punishment, not a ritual, but a harvest. Mother Agatha hadn't been trying to save souls. She'd been building a reliquary, a monument to suffering, a temple constructed from the bodies of children she believed were sanctified by their pain. The teeth, the investigators later determined, had been extracted post-mortem. The shoes belonged to each girl, taken upon their arrival and kept as markers of transformation. This chamber was Mother Agatha's masterwork, her proof of divinity, achieved through agony, and it had waited in darkness for over a century, perfectly preserved, waiting to be found. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead archaeologist on the 1996 excavation, later described the moment of discovery in an interview with PBS. "We knew the history. We'd read Clara Malin's testimony, but nothing prepares you for the reality of standing in a room deliberately designed as a monument to child murder. The murals weren't the work of a madwoman scrawling on walls. They were carefully planned, expertly executed. Someone had spent months, maybe years, painting those scenes. And the bone altar, it was architecturally sound. They'd studied engineering to build it. This wasn't chaotic evil. This was methodical, organized, purposeful evil. That's what made it so terrifying. The discovery prompted new investigations. Old church records were subpoenaed, hidden archives were opened, and slowly, investigators began to uncover a disturbing pattern. St. Allora's hadn't been the only institution of its kind. Between 1850 and 1920, at least 17 similar facilities had operated across the United States and Canada, all under different names, all claiming to provide moral reformation for wayward children. Most had closed quietly, their records destroyed or lost. But in the archives of these institutions, investigators found familiar names. Sister Marcella had worked at a home for girls in Massachusetts before joining St. Allora's in 1873. Brother Thorne had been employed at a boys' reformatory in Ohio from 1868 to 1871, where he'd been investigated but never charged in connection with the deaths of 6 students. Sister Eugenie had trained at an asylum in New York, where she'd developed her chemical expertise under the tutelage of doctors, experimenting with sedatives and compliance agents. They had been part of a network, moving from institution to institution, perfecting their methods, spreading their philosophy, and they weren't alone. The investigations uncovered correspondence between these facilities, letters discussing problematic children, successful transformations, and methods of ensuring permanent silence. And at the center of it all, connecting these facilities through correspondence and shared personnel, was a single figure, Mother Agatha Vale, who had begun her career not as a nun, but as a patient in a psychiatric hospital in Baltimore, where she'd been committed in 1856 for what Victorian doctors called religious mania. Her intake records, discovered in a Baltimore archive in 1998, painted a chilling picture. At age 23, Agatha Vale had been found in a church cellar with the bodies of 3 dead cats, which she claimed she'd purified through suffering to prove God's love. She'd carved crosses into their flesh while they were still alive. She told doctors that God spoke to her directly, instructing her in the sacred art of redemption through pain. She'd been released into the care of the church in 1859, deemed much improved and suitable for religious service. 3 years later, she founded St. Allora's. The woman who had tortured and killed over 100 children had been, from the very beginning, deeply and dangerously insane, and the church had given her authority, autonomy, and access to vulnerable children. The lawsuits that followed lasted years. Survivors from other institutions came forward, women now in their 70s and 80s, who'd spent lifetimes trying to forget what had been done to them. Families of victims demanded accountability. Advocacy groups called for investigations of every religious institution that had operated during that period. The church settled quietly, admitting no wrongdoing, paying reparations, promising reform. But Clara Malin, who had started it all by refusing to let the dead be forgotten, wasn't there to see it. She'd been gone for 74 years. Still, I like to think she knew. I like to think that somewhere, in whatever comes after this world, she heard the bells finally stop ringing and knew that the girl she'd carried in her memory for so long could finally rest. The memorial at the St. Alora's site was expanded in 2003. It now lists every recovered name, every identified victim, along with a plaque that reads, "Here lie the vanished girls of St. Alora's House of Restoration, children who suffered in silence and died in shadow. They were forgotten by the world, but remembered by one. May their voices echo in every act of justice, every protection of the vulnerable, every refusal to look away from evil, disguised as righteousness." They were numbers, now they are names. They were silenced, now they speak forever. But here's what keeps me awake at night. What haunted me after I found that initial ledger in a university archive, after I traced Clara's story through court documents and newspaper clippings, after I stood at the memorial and read those 109 names carved in stone. The ledger I found listed 143 girls who entered St. Allora's between 1862 and 1891. They recovered the remains of 109, which means 34 girls are still missing. 34 names in the ledger with no corresponding body, no grave, no explanation, just the notation departed or transferred, or in some cases, nothing at all, just a line through the name and empty space where their fate should have been recorded. Where did they go? The official explanation is that they were genuinely transferred, placed with families, sent to other institutions, that the darkness of St. Allora's wasn't absolute, that some girls actually escaped or were released. But I've spent 3 years investigating this, and I can't find records of any transfers. I can't find adoption papers, placement documents, letters of recommendation, nothing. Those 34 girls entered St. Allora's and then vanished completely, more thoroughly than even the dead. And here's what really terrifies me. 2 weeks ago, I received an unmarked package at my university office. No return address, postmarked from a small town in Montana I'd never heard of. Inside was a photograph, old and faded, showing a group of young women in gray uniforms, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. The architecture was similar to St. Allora's, the same Gothic Revival style, the same high windows, the same oppressive stone construction. On the back, written in spidery script, St. Catherine's Home for Penitent Girls, Montana, 1884. I compared the faces in the photograph to the images I'd collected from St. Allora's records. It took me 3 days, going through hundreds of photographs, but I found them. 3 of the faces matched. 3 of the missing 34, they hadn't died at St. Allora's. They'd been transferred after all, but not to freedom, to another institution, another cage, another house of horrors, operating under the guise of reformation. And if St. Catherine's existed, how many others were there? How many other forgotten places held the bones of forgotten children? I've started searching. I found references to 16 similar institutions in archived church correspondence, most closed before 1930, all with destroyed or missing records. St. Catherine's in Montana, the Magdalene Refuge in Vermont, House of the Sacred Heart in Ohio, the Penitent Sisters' Home in Massachusetts, all connected to the same network, all employing the same methods, all operating in the shadows with church approval and societal indifference. The ground-penetrating surveys have begun. The excavations are being planned, and I'm terrified of what we're going to find, because if the pattern holds, if each institution followed the same model as St. Allora's, we're not talking about 143 victims, we're talking about thousands, children who were swallowed by a system that saw them as raw materials for sanctification, whose suffering was reframed as salvation, whose deaths were recorded as ascensions. The bells of St. Allora's stopped ringing in 1878, but somewhere out there in the basements of collapsed buildings and the forests of forgotten properties, other bells might still be tolling, and the dead are still waiting for someone to remember their names. I keep Clara Malin's wooden spoon on my desk now, the original, preserved in archival plastic. Its 73 carved names still visible after all these years. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing records, I run my fingers over the protective case and wonder how many more spoons are buried out there, how many more lists carved in desperation, how many more voices crying out from beneath stone and ash. The university thinks I'm obsessed. My colleagues whisper that I've gone too deep, that I'm seeing patterns that don't exist, that not every closed institution was a house of horrors. My department chair suggested I take a sabbatical. My research grant was quietly reduced. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am seeing monsters in every shadow. But then I found something yesterday that suggests otherwise. A letter, dated 1887, from Mother Agatha to someone identified only as Brother Superior. It was filed incorrectly in a county records office, buried in a box of property deeds from a church sale. The clerk who helped me find it asked why I wanted 100-year-old letters about boring church stuff. I didn't tell her what it said. The letter discusses the project and mentions 17 sites of transformation operating successfully, with adequate supply maintained through the usual channels. It references shared techniques and distribution of successful candidates, a chilling phrase that suggests girls were being moved between facilities like inventory, and it ends with a single line that made my blood run cold. The harvest continues, and the garden grows. I don't know what it means, not fully, but I'm going to find out, because somewhere out there, in the dark soil of forgotten places, 34 girls from St. Allora's are still missing. And if Mother Agatha's network was real, if 17 institutions operated the way St. Allora's did, we're looking at a death toll that could number in the thousands. The excavations begin next month. 4 sites to start: Montana, Ohio, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Ground-penetrating radar has already identified anomalies at each location: chambers beneath chapels, spaces where there shouldn't be spaces, patterns in the soil that suggest organized burial. And in one site, the Vermont location where Sister Eugenie died in that fire in 1892, the radar picked up something that the technician couldn't explain: a regular pattern of small cavities arranged in rows, at least 50 of them, each approximately 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. 50 graves, all unmarked, all forgotten, child-sized. I'll be there when they dig. I'll be there when they open the earth and bring those children back into the light. I'll be there to count them, to document them, to give them names if we can find them, because someone has to remember. Someone has to refuse to look away. Clara Malin did it for 73 girls over the course of her entire life. I'm going to do it for however many it takes, for however long it takes. The bells of St. Allora's stopped ringing a century ago, but the silence that followed was worse than any sound, and in that silence, the dead are still screaming. Can you hear them? I can. Every night, I hear them. The whisper of small feet on stone floors, the muffled crying of children who were taught that suffering was love, the prayers recited in darkness by girls who didn't understand why God had abandoned them. And I won't stop listening until every last girl is found, every last name is spoken, every last stone is turned over, because the vanishing girls of St. Allora's aren't just history, they're a warning about what happens when we trust institutions more than we trust the voices of children, about what happens when we look away from suffering because acknowledging it is inconvenient, about what happens when evil wraps itself in righteousness and we're too afraid to pull back the cloth. The memorial at St. Alora's has 109 names carved in stone. Next year, if our excavations confirm what I suspect, we'll need to carve 1,000 more, and somewhere, in the darkness beneath forgotten ground, the harvest Mother Agatha spoke of is still waiting to be unearthed. The question is, are we ready for what we're going to find, or will we do what the world did in 1896 and in 1924, and every year since? Will we express our shock, our horror, our disbelief, and then look away again, letting the dead sink back into silence, letting the stones resettle over the truth? I hope not. God, I hope not, because those 34 missing girls from St. Alora's deserve better. The thousands of children who passed through Mother Agatha's network deserve better. Every child who suffered in silence, who died in shadow, who was erased from history, deserves to be remembered. And if it takes the rest of my life to find them all, then that's what I'll do. Clara Malin spent 18 years remembering 73 names before she finally came forward. I can do at least that much for the thousands who came after. The excavations begin in 37 days. I'll let you know what we find, but I suspect, deep in my bones, that what we uncover will be worse than anything we've imagined, because the vanishing girls of St. Allora's were just the beginning, and the harvest Mother Agatha spoke of, it might not be finished yet. Last night, I received another unmarked package. Inside was a single child's shoe, small and worn, filled with what looked like teeth, and a note written in the same spidery script as before. The garden remembers. The garden always remembers. How many flowers will you find when you finally dig deep enough? I don't know who's sending these packages. I don't know if it's someone trying to help the investigation or someone trying to stop it, but I know this. Somewhere out there, the truth is waiting, and I'm going to find it, even if it kills me. The dead deserve that much. Clara Malin would have expected nothing less.